The year was 1881, and the silence of Arthur Blackwood's ranch was a living thing. It was a pressure in the air, a weight that settled in the hollows of the small cabin he'd built with his own hands, and it seeped into the marrow of his bones. Out here on the vast, wind-scoured plains of the Dakota Territory, the land itself was a study in emptiness. It stretched in every direction, a rolling sea of dun-colored grass under a sky so immense it could make a man feel like an afterthought of God. For Arthur, the emptiness outside was merely a reflection of the emptiness within. His life was a metronome of solitude, each day a precise echo of the one before. Dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in fragile shades of rose and gray, and he would rise. He would move through the chilled air of the cabin, his boots sounding like lonely drumbeats on the wooden floorboards. He'd make coffee, eat a slab of day-old bread, and then step out into the bracing wind to face his chores. There were fences to mend where the wild herds had pushed through, cattle to check for sickness or injury, and the endless, thankless task of simply holding his own against a land that seemed determined to reclaim everything man built upon it. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency, his movements economical and strong, but his eyes held a permanent distance, as if he were looking at a world from which he had been irrevocably detached. This was not the life he had planned. Years ago, this very land had been a canvas for a vibrant dream, one he was to paint with his wife, Martha. Her laughter had been the music that filled the silence, her presence the warmth that defied the prairie winters. They had spoken of children, a whole house full of them, their small, bright voices chasing away the shadows. They had imagined a legacy taking root in this soil, a dynasty of Blackwoods growing strong under the Dakota sun. But the land, as it so often did, had taken more than it gave. A fever had stolen Martha in the space of a single, brutal week, leaving Arthur in a world leached of its color. The silence she left behind was profound, but the discovery that followed was a crueler blow. A visit to a doctor in a town 2 days' ride away, driven by a quiet, nagging fear that had predated Martha's death, confirmed his deepest dread. He was the reason their dream of children had never blossomed. The fault was his. The soil was fertile, but the seed was barren. He had told no one. The knowledge was a shard of glass he carried inside him, a secret shame that defined his existence more than any fence line or brand on his cattle. He was a dead end, a final solitary link in a chain that would go no further. And so he had retreated into his work, into his isolation, allowing the grief and the shame to build a wall around him as sturdy as the sod walls of his home. One late autumn afternoon, the sky began to curdle. The usual pale blue bruised into a sullen, heavy grey, and the wind, once a steady whisper, began to keen with a rising, frantic pitch. A blue norther was coming, one of those savage storms that could drop the temperature by 40 degrees in an hour and blind a man with sleet and snow. Arthur was out on the far western edge of his property, checking on a newborn calf, when the first icy pellets began to sting his cheeks. He turned his horse, pulling his collar tighter, his mind already on the warmth of his hearth. It was then, through the increasingly thick curtain of driving sleet, that he saw it. A smudge of color against the graying landscape, something that did not belong. Curiosity, a long-dormant instinct, warred with the ingrained caution of a man living on the frontier. His first thought was a wolf, or perhaps a wounded deer. He guided his horse closer, his hand resting almost unconsciously on the stock of the rifle in his scabbard. As he neared, the shape resolved itself. It was not an animal. It was a person collapsed in a heap at the base of a small rise, little more than a bundle of rags. He dismounted, the wind tearing at his coat, and approached slowly. It was a girl, a native girl, no older than 16 or 17. She was frighteningly thin, her cheekbones sharp angles beneath skin stretched taut and chapped by the elements. Her deerskin dress was torn and muddy, and her feet, wrapped in worn moccasins, were raw and blistered. She was unconscious, or perhaps simply too weak to move, her breathing shallow and ragged. For a long moment, Arthur just stood there, the storm raging around them. Every instinct for self-preservation, every story of raids and mistrust whispered in town, screamed at him to turn back, to leave her to the fate the prairie had chosen for her. It was not his concern. He had enough burdens of his own. But then, a stray lock of her dark hair, plastered to her temple with sleet, reminded him of Martha. It was a foolish, fleeting comparison, yet it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at her small, still form, at the utter vulnerability in her exposure to the storm's fury, and the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart began to crumble. He could not leave her. To do so would be to surrender the last vestige of the man Martha had loved. With a groan that was part effort, part despair, he gently scooped her into his arms. She was shockingly light, like a bird with hollow bones. He carried her to his horse, mounted with difficulty, and cradled her against his chest, turning his back to the wind to shield her as they began the slow, arduous journey home. Inside the cabin, the sudden warmth and quiet felt like another world. He laid her gently on the simple cot that served as his bed, the mattress stuffed with straw and old wool. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, wide with a feral terror, and a small, guttural sound escaped her throat. She tried to scramble away, but she had no strength. "Easy now," Arthur said, his voice rough from disuse. The words were for his own benefit. He knew she would not understand them. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, backing away to give her space. He stoked the fire, adding logs until it blazed, casting dancing shadows across the small room. The flickering light played over her face, revealing the exhaustion and fear etched there. He ladled some thin broth from the pot that was always simmering on the hearth into a bowl. It was mostly water and a few vegetables, but it was hot. He approached her as one would a wild, cornered thing, holding the bowl out. She stared at it, then at him, her dark eyes filled with a deep, bottomless suspicion. He set the bowl on the small crate beside the bed and retreated to the other side of the room, sitting in his worn armchair. He would not force her. He would simply wait. For what felt like an hour, they existed in this tableau of silent tension. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside, a mournful cry that seemed to seep through the very logs of the cabin. Finally, driven by a hunger that must have been agonizing, she stirred. With trembling hands, she reached for the bowl and brought it to her lips, sipping the warm liquid with a desperate, animal need. She drank it all, her gaze never leaving him, as if expecting him to strike at any moment. When she was finished, she set the bowl down and curled into herself, pulling the rough wool blanket he had placed over her up to her chin. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed her, and she fell into a deep, troubled sleep. Arthur did not go to bed. He remained in his chair, his rifle across his lap, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. He was a sentry in his own home, guarding against a threat he had willingly invited inside. He felt a profound sense of dislocation. The rigid, predictable solitude of his life had been shattered. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the breathing of another human being. It was a terrifying and strangely comforting sound. He thought of the stories he'd heard, of the Dakota bands whose territory this was. He had trespassed on their world by taking her, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that there would be consequences. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the world scrubbed clean and encased in a thin, glittering layer of ice. When Arthur stepped outside, the air was so cold it felt sharp in his lungs. The sky was a vast, pristine blue. He did his morning chores on autopilot, his mind consumed by the girl inside his cabin. When he returned, she was awake. She was sitting up on the bed, the blanket clutched around her, watching the door. The fear in her eyes was still there, but it was tempered now with a flicker of curiosity. He moved about the cabin, making coffee, slicing bread. He set a piece of bread and a mug of weak, sweetened coffee on the crate beside her. She watched his every move. He ate his own breakfast, standing by the hearth, his back partially to her, trying to appear non-threatening. For a long while, there was only the sound of him eating and the soft crackle of the flames. Then he heard a small noise. He glanced over his shoulder. She was eating the bread, tearing off small pieces and chewing them slowly, methodically. Later that morning, he knew he had to tend to her feet. He heated water and brought the basin to her bedside along with some clean rags and a jar of salve. When she saw him approach, she flinched, pulling her feet back under the blanket. He stopped, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. He pointed to his own boots, then to her feet, then to the basin. He mimed the act of washing. Understanding, or at least a guess at his intent, dawned in her eyes. Hesitantly, she extended her feet from beneath the blanket. They were in a terrible state, swollen and raw, the moccasins having offered little protection. He worked with a gentle, impersonal efficiency, soaking the rags in the warm water and carefully cleaning the grime and blood away. She winced, biting her lip to stifle a cry, but she did not pull away. As he worked, he felt the fragile bones, the delicate arch of her foot. It was an act of simple, necessary care, yet it felt monumental. It was the first time in years he had offered comfort to another living soul, the first time he had touched someone with tenderness. When he was done, he applied the cool, soothing salve and wrapped her feet in clean strips of cloth. He did it all without meeting her eyes, a strange sort of shame or shyness prickling at him. He spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened awareness. He went about his routine, but part of him was always attuned to her presence. She remained on the cot, mostly silent, but he could feel her watching him. Late in the afternoon, as he was mending a piece of tack, he felt her gaze on the small, crude mantelpiece above the fire. She was looking at the single photograph he owned, a small, fading tintype of Martha, taken not long after their wedding. He stopped his work, his hands suddenly still. She looked from the photograph to him, a question in her dark eyes. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He offered no explanation, and she asked for none, but in that shared, silent moment of acknowledgement, a tiny, fragile bridge was built between them. He saw not a savage, but a young woman. And perhaps, in his stoic grief, she saw not an enemy, but a man who understood loss. The next morning began like any other, until it did not. Arthur had just stepped out of his cabin, the sun a pale wafer in the eastern sky, when he felt at first a low, rhythmic vibration in the frozen earth. It was a sound before it was a sound, a feeling that resonated up through the soles of his boots. He froze, his hand shading his eyes as he scanned the horizon, and then he saw them. They crested the long, low rise to the east, a sight so terrible and magnificent it stole the breath from his lungs. Warriors, not a small band but a multitude, spread out in a wide, silent line. He tried to count, but lost track after 100. There had to be 200, maybe more, their forms dark and formidable against the morning sky. They were all on horseback, armed with rifles and lances that glinted in the cold sunlight. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, a tide of silent judgment rolling toward his small, insignificant homestead. At their center rode a man who was clearly their leader, his bearing regal and severe. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Arthur's stoicism. This was it. This was the reckoning he had known was coming. His mind raced. He could run inside, bar the door, try to make a stand. It would be futile. They would burn the cabin to the ground with him inside. His only weapon was his rifle, and he was one man against an army. Just as the thought of bolting the door crossed his mind, it flew open behind him. The girl Winona, he would later learn was her name, stood there, framed in the doorway. She took in the scene with a single, wide-eyed glance. For a moment, she looked at the approaching warriors, and then she looked at Arthur. He saw a flash of understanding, of decision, in her eyes. He expected her to run to them, to her people, to point an accusing finger at the white man who had taken her. She did not. Instead, she walked out of the cabin and came to stand beside him. She placed herself just slightly in front of him, a small, defiant figure in a borrowed wool blanket, facing the oncoming tide. It was a gesture of protection, so unexpected and so profound that it shocked Arthur more than the appearance of the warriors. In that single silent action, she was declaring him an ally, not a captor. A wave of something fierce and protective washed over him, extinguishing his fear. He straightened his shoulders and stood his ground beside her, his hands open at his sides. They would face this together. The warriors halted about 50 yards from the cabin, a silent, intimidating wall of horseflesh and hardened men. The chief at their center urged his horse forward, stopping just 10 paces from where Arthur and Winona stood. He was a man in his prime, his face a mask of stern authority, his eyes sharp and intelligent. He looked at Winona, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion-overwhelming relief crossed his stoic features. He spoke to her in their language, his voice a low, guttural rumble. She replied, her voice soft but clear, gesturing from the storm-swept plains to the cabin, and then to Arthur. As she spoke, the chief's gaze shifted to Arthur. He studied him intently, his eyes missing nothing the worn but clean clothes, the calloused hands, the exhaustion and grief that were etched into the lines of his face, and the undeniable fact that he stood unbowed, not with aggression, but with a quiet dignity. When Winona finished, the chief, Chaitan, looked at Arthur and spoke, his English heavily accented but clear. "You found my daughter." It was a statement, not a question. Arthur simply nodded. "I found her. The storm was coming. She was starving." "You gave her shelter," Chaitan said, his eyes moving to the cabin, to the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. "You gave her food." "She needed help," Arthur said, his voice level. "I gave it." Chaitan was silent for a long time, his gaze sweeping over Arthur's small, solitary domain. He saw the neatly stacked woodpile, the well-mended fence, the lonely cabin. He saw a life of hard work and deep solitude. His eyes, wise and perceptive, saw the hollowness that the work could not fill. He looked from Arthur back to his daughter, who stood her ground, a silent testament to the kindness she had been shown. He dismounted, a sign of respect that did not go unnoticed by Arthur. "My daughter, Winona, was lost from our hunting party. We searched. The storm came. We believed the Great Spirit had called her home," Chaitan said, his voice softer now. "We mourned her. You have returned her to us. This is a great debt." Arthur shook his head. "There is no debt. I did what any man should." "Not any man," Chaitan corrected, his eyes locking with Arthur's. "Many in your world would have left her to the wind or worse." He took a step closer. "I have looked at your home. It is a strong home, but it is quiet. There is no sound of children. Your heart is quiet, like a field in winter." The observation was so personal, so unnervingly accurate, that it struck Arthur like a physical blow. The shame of his barrenness, the core of his private grief, rose in him. He stiffened, waiting for the mockery, the judgment. But it did not come. Instead, Chaitan's expression was one of profound understanding, even empathy. "My people, we are not strong," he admitted, the confession costing him visible effort. "The white man's sickness has visited our lodges. It takes the young, the babes. Many do not see their first winter. We have children, but their futures are like smoke. We have warriors, but we do not know the ways of this new world, the ways of the cattle and the fence." He paused, letting his words settle in the cold morning air. Then he made his offer, an offer so extraordinary it seemed to alter the very fabric of the world around them. "You have returned a child to me," Chaitan said, his voice resonating with authority and sincerity. "But you have no children of your own. Your land is rich, but your house is empty. My people have children, but their hands are empty. This cannot be right. The Great Spirit does not favor such imbalance." He gestured back toward his warriors, then toward Arthur's ranch. "Teach us. Teach our young men your ways with the land. Show them how to raise the cattle, how to build what lasts. Share your knowledge. which is a strength our people need to survive. In return, he said, his gaze unwavering, my people will be your people. This house will not be empty. Our hunters will bring you meat. Our women will help mend your clothes. Our children will fill this quiet land with their voices. You will not be a lone man against the prairie. You will be an elder. You will be a grandfather to a nation. You will have a family, Arthur Blackwood, a family larger than any you dreamed of. Arthur stood, stunned into silence. The offer was breathtaking. It was not a transaction. It was a weaving together of two worlds, of two deep and desperate needs. It was a solution to a problem he thought was absolute and eternal. He looked at Chaitin, a chief willing to humble himself for the future of his people. He looked at Winona, the girl whose life he had saved, who had, in turn, saved his. And he looked past them, at the 250 warriors sitting silently on their horses, their faces no longer masks of hostility, but of cautious, desperate hope. The weight of years of loneliness, of the crushing belief in his own uselessness, began to lift. It was like the breaking of a fever. A future he could never have imagined, a purpose far grander than mere survival, was being laid at his feet. It was a terrifying, beautiful, and sacred thing. A slow smile touched Arthur's lips for the first time in years. It was a rusty, unfamiliar movement, but it reached his eyes, erasing some of the sorrow that had lived there for so long. He looked at Chief Chaitin and gave a single, decisive nod. I will, he said, and with those two words, the silence of his life was broken forever. The seasons that followed were a time of profound transformation. The change was not immediate or easy. It was a slow, careful process of building trust, one shared task, one halting conversation at a time. The first to arrive were a handful of teenage boys, their eyes a mixture of suspicion and awe. They were shy and proud, watching Arthur's every move. He started simply, showing them how to properly set a fence post, how to read the health of a cow from the look in its eye, how to anticipate the weather by the feel of the air. Language was a barrier, but the work itself became a language. A shared grunt of effort in lifting a heavy log, a mutual nod of satisfaction at a well-mended gate, a quiet moment of rest watching the cattle graze peacefully, these became their conversations. Winona was often the bridge. She would visit the ranch, her presence a calming influence, translating not just words, but intent. She helped Arthur understand their ways, their deep respect for the land, and he, in turn, shared with her the stories behind his tools, his methods, his quiet grief for Martha. Slowly, Arthur's cabin ceased to be a fortress of solitude. In the evenings, the boys would sit by his fire, and he would share his meal with them. At first, the silence was heavy, but gradually it became comfortable. Then it was broken by the boys' own language, their soft chatter, a strange and wonderful music in the house that had known only silence. Soon, other members of the tribe would appear at his door. A hunter would leave a fresh quarter of venison on his porch without a word. A woman would bring him a pair of intricately beaded moccasins, far warmer and more durable than his worn-out boots. Arthur learned as much as he taught. He learned which wild herbs could soothe a fever, how to track game with an almost supernatural skill, and how to read the stories the stars told in the vast, dark sky. He was no longer just a rancher. He was part of a complex and vibrant community, a tapestry of lives interwoven with his own. The boys he taught became like sons to him. He watched them grow in skill and confidence, their laughter echoing across the pastures where he had once walked alone. Toddlers from the village would sometimes come with their mothers, and they would stare at him with wide, curious eyes, eventually growing bold enough to tug on his sleeve. He was no longer Arthur Blackwood, the barren man. He was Tashunka Scar, the white bull, the man who knew the ways of the cattle, their elder, their friend. One summer evening, years after the warriors had first crested that hill, Arthur sat on his porch, watching the sun set. The sky was awash in fiery color. A group of the young men he had mentored were expertly herding the cattle into the corral for the night, their calls and whistles carrying on the gentle breeze. Near the cabin, Winona sat with a few other women, their hands busy with beadwork, their quiet conversation a comforting murmur. A small child, Chayton's own grandson, toddled over and leaned against Arthur's knee, looking up at him with complete trust. Arthur placed a hand on the boy's head, his heart full to bursting. He looked out over his land. It was the same land, the same sky, the same cabin, but it was no longer empty. It was teeming with life, with connection, with purpose. He had once believed his legacy had died with his dream of a family. He now saw how wrong he had been. His legacy was in the thriving herd, in the skills he had passed on, in the bridge of respect and affection that now stood between two peoples. He had found his home not in blood, but in the boundless territory of the human heart, where kindness, when offered, could make even the most barren ground bloom with life. The silence was gone, and in its place was the rich, enduring sound of belonging.